Three county inspectors showed up at my house on a Tuesday morning because someone wanted my workshop gone. By sunset, my workshop had passed every inspection, and the man who reported me was staring at a giant red stop work order nailed to his own construction project. Funny thing is, none of this would have happened if he just left me alone. My name is Ethan Parker, and a few years ago, I moved into a neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, a quiet town where people mostly minded their own business, waved when they drove by, and spent weekends mowing lawns or grilling in their driveways. It wasn't the kind of place where drama usually happened, which is probably why everyone noticed when mine started. Behind my house sat a small metal workshop. Nothing fancy, just a clean gray building tucked behind a line of oak trees. I'd built it 3 years earlier after checking every county requirement, every setback rule, every HOA guideline I could find. The permit process took forever, but I did it right because I didn't want problems later. The workshop became my favorite place on the property. After work, I'd spend hours out there rebuilding old lawnmowers, fixing generators, restoring tools, or making small woodworking projects. Sometimes neighbors would stop by and ask if I could repair something. A broken gate hinge, a weed trimmer that wouldn't start, a kid's bicycle with a bent wheel. I never charged much. Half the time, I didn't charge anything at all. I just liked working with my hands. There was something satisfying about taking something broken and making it useful again. Most people in the neighborhood appreciated it. If Mrs. Dalton's mower died in the middle of summer, she knew I could usually get it running. If someone's fence latch snapped after a storm, I probably had a spare part sitting somewhere in the workshop. Life was simple. At least it was until Randall Pierce became HOA president. Now, Randall wasn't the worst person I'd ever met, but he was definitely one of those guys who enjoyed having authority more than he enjoyed helping people. The first year he got elected, he started walking the neighborhood every weekend with a clipboard. Nobody knew exactly what he was writing down, but somehow violation letters started appearing in mailboxes all over the community. Trash cans left out too long, a basketball hoop visible from the street, a garden shed painted the wrong shade of beige. Little things, petty things. Things nobody had cared about before. The first time Randall mentioned my workshop was during an HOA meeting. We were discussing landscaping budgets when he suddenly pointed at me and said, "Some structures in this neighborhood are starting to look more industrial than residential." Everybody knew what he meant. I smiled and asked, "You talking about my workshop?" He smiled back, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "If the shoe fits." A few people laughed awkwardly. I remember feeling annoyed, but not worried. I knew the building complied with every rule. Still, after the meeting, I walked out to the parking lot and Randall followed me. He stopped beside my truck and looked toward my property in the distance. "You know," he said casually, "that workshop really doesn't fit the image we're trying to create around here." I shrugged. Good thing the rules don't mention image. His jaw tightened for just a second. Then he laughed. "We'll see." At the time, I didn't think much about it. Looking back, that conversation was probably the moment he decided to make me a target. About 3 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from the HOA. According to the letter, my workshop was allegedly violating community standards and needed to be removed or modified immediately. If I failed to comply, daily fines would begin. I read the letter twice because it honestly didn't make sense. There wasn't a specific violation listed, just vague language about appearance and compatibility with neighborhood aesthetics. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the HOA handbook spread out in front of me. I went through every section. Then I went through it again. Height restrictions? Compliant. Property setbacks? Compliant. Exterior calles? Compliant. Roofing materials? Compliant. Every single requirement checked out. The next morning, I took photographs from every angle, highlighted the relevant sections of the HOA guidelines, and mailed everything back with a polite letter explaining that the workshop met all community standards. I figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks passed without a response. Then one afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found an official notice from the county. Somebody had reported an unpermitted structure on my property and requested an investigation. I remember standing there in my driveway, reading the letter while a knot formed in my stomach. Because suddenly this wasn't an HOA disagreement anymore. This was the county. This involved inspectors, permits, records, and potential legal issues. Then something clicked. The timing was too perfect. Randall couldn't force me to remove the workshop through the HOA rules, so he had found another way. He reported me to the county hoping they'd do what he couldn't. I stood there for a minute, looking toward his house at the far end of the street. Construction crews were working behind it again. For months he'd been building some massive addition that seemed to get larger every time I saw it. At the time, I barely paid attention. My workshop was my concern. His property was his business. But as I watched trucks moving in and out of his driveway that afternoon, I had no idea those construction crews were about to become the biggest mistake Randall Pierce ever made. And instead of waiting nervously for the county to show up, I made a decision that would change everything. I picked up the phone and scheduled the inspection myself. The woman at the county office sounded almost surprised when I called. Most people, she told me, waited until inspectors contacted them. I told her there was no reason to wait. The workshop had permits, records, photographs, everything documented from the day it was built. If somebody wanted it inspected, I wanted it inspected properly. She scheduled a visit for the following Thursday. Over the next week, I dug every piece of paperwork out of my filing cabinet. Original permits, site plans, survey documents, inspection approvals. I stacked everything neatly on my dining room table. Not because I thought I was in trouble, but because I wanted zero ambiguity. If there was one thing I'd learned over the years, it was that bureaucracy becomes much easier when you're organized. Meanwhile, Randall seemed unusually cheerful. Every time I saw him around the neighborhood, he wore that little smirk people get when they think they're holding a winning hand. One afternoon, he passed me while I was unloading lumber from my truck. "Heard the county's taking a look at your place," he said. I nodded. "Yep, that's unfortunate. Maybe." He leaned against his SUV and crossed his arms. "Sometimes these things don't go the way people expect." I remember smiling because the irony of that statement would become absolutely incredible later. "You're right about that," I told him. "Sometimes they really don't." Thursday morning arrived clear and sunny. Around 9 o'clock, a county pickup truck rolled into my driveway. The inspector introduced himself as Mark Delaney, a middle-aged guy with a calm voice and the kind of demeanor that immediately puts people at ease. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for facts. Those are very different things. We walked through the workshop together. He measured distances from property lines, checked electrical panels, looked at the foundation, examined ventilation systems, and compared everything against the approved plans. As he worked, we talked about ordinary things. Fishing, old trucks, the heat wave we'd been having. It felt less like an interrogation and more like a guy doing his job thoroughly. About 20 minutes into the inspection, he closed his clipboard and nodded. "Everything looks good here." I felt a wave of relief, even though I'd expected that result. Then he looked past my shoulder toward the neighboring property and squinted. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." He pointed toward Randall's backyard. "What's going on over there?" I turned around. Construction workers were moving lumber around a partially framed structure that towered over the fence line. "He's building an addition, I think." Mark kept staring at it. "An addition?" That's what I heard. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly walked toward the property line. I followed a few steps behind. The closer we got, the more interested he seemed. He studied the framing, the roof line, the plumbing rough ends, the garage opening beneath the structure. Then he muttered something under his breath that I couldn't quite hear. "Problem?" I asked. He glanced at me. Maybe, maybe not. Then he walked directly toward the construction site. The foreman spotted him coming and immediately looked nervous. Mark introduced himself and requested permit documentation. The workers exchanged glances. Nobody had permits available. That didn't automatically mean something was wrong, but it definitely got his attention. He asked for the permit number. The foreman gave him one from memory. Mark stepped aside and made a phone call. I watched from my yard while construction activity gradually slowed. Workers stopped carrying materials. Nail guns went quiet. The entire site seemed to sense that something unusual was happening. About 15 minutes later, Mark returned from his call. His expression had completely changed. The easygoing inspector who'd been joking with me about fishing was gone. Now he looked focused, very focused. He walked around the structure again, taking photographs from multiple angles. Then he measured several sections and compared notes against information on his tablet. After another 10 minutes, he approached the foreman. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but I caught enough. This isn't what was approved. You'll need to stop work immediately. Additional inspectors are being dispatched. At that moment, I realized this was getting serious. Really serious. Less than an hour later, another county vehicle arrived. Then a third. The neighborhood started noticing. Curtains moved. Garage doors opened. People found reasons to be outside. One thing about suburban neighborhoods is that major drama spreads faster than wildfire. By lunchtime, half the street was quietly watching from a distance. Randall finally arrived home shortly after noon. The second he saw the county vehicles parked near his property, he slammed on the brakes so hard I heard the tires squeal from my driveway. He jumped out of his truck and marched straight toward the inspectors. Even from across the street, I could tell he was angry. Arms waving, voice raised, face turning red. Mark remained completely calm. Randall pointed repeatedly toward my house, as if trying to redirect attention back to me. At one point, I actually heard him shout, "That's the property you should be looking at." Mark replied with a sentence I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "Sir, we've already completed that inspection." The look on Randall's face was priceless. It was the exact moment he realized the plan had failed. Not only had my workshop passed inspection, but the inspection had accidentally uncovered something much bigger on his property. Over the next several hours, county officials documented everything. The deeper they looked, the worse it got. Randall had apparently obtained permits for a relatively small patio expansion. What he was actually building looked more like a second residence attached to the rear of his home. The approved drawings and the actual structure barely resembled each other. There were additional plumbing systems, additional electrical systems, a full garage underneath, expanded square footage, structural changes that had never been reviewed. Somewhere along the way, Randall had apparently decided permits were more of a suggestion than a requirement. Unfortunately for him, county inspectors tend to disagree with that philosophy. Late that afternoon, one of the officials carried over a large red notice. Every worker on site seemed to stop moving as they watched. The notice was attached prominently near the entrance where nobody could possibly miss it. "Stop work order." The words practically glowed in the afternoon sunlight. Construction ceased immediately. Nail gun stopped. Equipment shut down. Workers packed up tools and began leaving. A concrete truck scheduled for delivery later that day was turned around before it even entered the neighborhood. Randall stood there staring at the notice as if he couldn't believe it was real. For months, he'd been convinced he was the smartest guy in the room. Now he was learning a lesson that tends to hit powerful people especially hard. Rules don't stop applying just because you're the one enforcing them. The following week became one long chain reaction. Engineers started visiting his property. Surveyors appeared. County officials conducted additional reviews. Rumors spread everywhere. One neighbor claimed the fines could reach tens of thousands of dollars. Another said portions of structure might need to be demolished entirely. Nobody knew the full truth, but everyone knew the project was in serious trouble. During all of this, my own situation wrapped up quietly. A few days after the inspection, I received an official county letter confirming that the workshop complied with all applicable regulations and required no corrective action whatsoever. That piece of paper felt surprisingly satisfying, not because I'd won anything, but because it confirmed what I'd known from the beginning. I had followed the rules. The whole ordeal should never have happened. A week later came the monthly HOA meeting. Usually attendance was mediocre. That night the room was packed. People showed up under the excuse of community business, but everyone knew why they were really there. They wanted to see Randall. When he entered the room, conversations immediately quieted. He looked exhausted. The confident swagger was gone. The smug smile was gone. Even the way he walked seemed different. For the first time since becoming HOA president, he looked like an ordinary guy instead of a self-appointed sheriff. The meeting started awkwardly. Nobody mentioned the construction project at first. Everyone danced around it. Then an older resident named Carol finally broke the tension. "How's the building project coming along, Randall?" The room went silent. You could practically hear people try not to laugh. Randall stared at his paperwork for several seconds before answering. "We're working through some permitting issues. Carol nodded innocently. Oh, that single word somehow made the situation even funnier. For the rest of the meeting, Randall barely spoke. No lectures about neighborhood appearance. No comments about compliance. No warnings about community standards. The man who had spent years scrutinizing everyone else's property suddenly seemed very interested in avoiding discussions about his own. And honestly, I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Because while I never wanted him humiliated, I couldn't ignore the fact that every problem he was facing had started with a choice he made himself. Nobody forced him to report my workshop. Nobody forced him to misuse his position. Nobody forced him to expand a construction project far beyond what his permits allowed. Every domino had fallen because he pushed the first one. Over the next few months, the situation slowly settled into something that almost felt normal again, although the neighborhood would never look at Randall Pierce the same way. Every week, there seemed to be a new truck parked outside his house. Architects, engineers, inspectors, contractors. At one point, part of the framing that had already been completed disappeared entirely, and that's when people realized the rumors had probably been true. Whatever agreement he eventually reached with the county, it clearly wasn't cheap. One afternoon, I was out in my workshop rebuilding an old riding mower when my neighbor Greg stopped by. He leaned against the doorway, watched me work for a minute, then laughed. You know, if Randall had just left this place alone, none of that would have happened. I wiped grease off my hands and looked around the shop. The same workbench, the same tools, the same building that had somehow become the center of the biggest controversy our neighborhood had seen in years. I've thought about that, I admit it, a lot actually, because the truth is, Greg was right. Everything would have been different if Randall had simply minded his own business. My workshop wasn't hurting anyone. It wasn't lowering property values. It wasn't creating noise complaints. It wasn't violating any rules. What bothered Randall wasn't the building itself. Looking back, I think what bothered him was the fact that he couldn't control it. Some people become uncomfortable when they encounter something they can't influence, especially after getting used to having authority. The workshop represented a limit to his power, and for someone like Randall, that may have been harder to accept than any supposed violation. A few weeks later, something happened that surprised me even more. Randall knocked on my door. The last person I expected to see standing on my front porch was him. For a second, I honestly thought another argument was about to start. Instead, he stood there awkwardly with his hands in his pockets. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically older, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from months of stress and expensive mistakes. We stood there in silence for a few seconds before he finally spoke. I probably handled things wrong. Now, that wasn't exactly a full apology. It wasn't even close. But coming from Randall, it was practically a confession. I nodded and let him continue. The workshop bothered me, he admitted. I thought if the county looked at it, they'd find something. I almost laughed at how absurd that sounded after everything that happened. Well, I said they found something. For the first time in years, he actually smiled. Not a smug smile. Not a superior smile. Just a tired one. Yeah, they did. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. Nothing dramatic. No emotional reconciliation. No movie-style ending where enemies suddenly become friends. Just two neighbors standing on a porch discussing consequences. Before he left, he looked toward the workshop one more time. It's a nice building, he said. Then he walked away. I stood there for a moment, wondering if the entire ordeal had finally taught him something. Maybe it had. Maybe it hadn't. People don't always change because they get caught. Sometimes they just become more careful. That's why I still don't know whether Randall learned humility or simply learned what happens when arrogance collides with reality. Either way, the outcome was the same. The complaints stopped. The letters stopped. The inspections stopped. Life moved forward. Today, the workshop is still standing exactly where it was before all of this started. On most weekends, you'll find me out there working on some project, drinking bad coffee, listening to old country music, and try to convince rusty machines to cooperate. Kids still bring bicycles over. Neighbors still ask for help fixing equipment. Sometimes people driving through the neighborhood don't even realize the little building was once at the center of a battle that nearly tore apart the HOA leadership. And honestly, that's probably how it should be. The funny thing is that people often ask whether I felt satisfied watching Randall's project get shut down. The answer is complicated. Part of me did. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. Watching someone who spent months targeting me suddenly face the consequences of his own decisions felt like justice in its purest form. But another part of me felt something different. Relief. Because the real victory wasn't that Randall lost. The real victory was that I never had to become the kind of person he expected me to be. I didn't retaliate. I didn't file complaints. I didn't look for ways to hurt him. I simply trusted the facts and let the process play out. The county inspectors weren't my weapon. They were just doing their jobs. Randall created his own downfall long before they ever arrived. He just didn't realize it yet. Sometimes that's how life works. People spend so much time digging holes for others that they stop noticing the one forming beneath their own feet. And if there's one lesson I took away from this whole experience, it's that power can be a dangerous thing when it's mixed with pride. A person who thinks rules only apply to everyone else eventually runs into reality. Reality doesn't care about titles. It doesn't care about authority. It doesn't care whether you're HOA president, mayor, CEO, or the loudest voice in the room. Eventually, the truth shows up, and when it does, it tends to be very thorough. So that's my story. A small workshop. One angry HOA president. A county inspection that was supposed to destroy me. And a giant construction project that ended up collapsing under the weight of its own shortcuts. But here's the question I've never been able to answer completely. If you were in my position, would you have done anything differently? Would you have reported Randall after discovering what he was building, or would you have left it alone? Do you think what happened to him was justice, karma, or simply the predictable result of his own choices? Let me know down in the comments, because I've heard strong arguments from both sides, and honestly, even after all these years, I'm still curious where people draw the line between accountability and revenge. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own HOA experiences below. Some of the stories people post are even crazier than mine, and trust me, after everything that happened on my street, that's saying something.